I want to extend my warmest congratulations on the Holberg Prize.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The Holberg Prize, of course, is not the first prize that you have won. Several of your books have won prestigious prizes, honorary fellowships and doctorates at 14 different universities worldwide. You're a fellow of the British Academy, and you were appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2008, and then earlier this year you were appointed Dame Commander of the British Empire for your services to higher education and literary scholarship. So it's quite an impressive CV, to say the least. And I'm not going to recount your whole bibliography today, because that will take up all the space we have, I guess. But I managed to count 34 full-length book publications, alongside numerous articles, journalisms you also write, and then a lot of talks, presentations, several places. When asked to summarize your work yourself, you stated that your work is dedicated to, quote, understand the human love of telling fantastic stories. And as far as I understand, this quest is also a personal quest and a desire to understand your own life. As you explain in Stranger Magic, you were brought up a Catholic, and even though you have struggled to free yourself from your faith a long time ago, you say, you are still attracted to implausible, impossible, and fantastic stories, an attraction that puzzles you, you write. So I was wondering if you could start to tell us a little bit more about the forces that led you into a lifelong study of these fantastic stories, myths and fairy tales, and where it has taken you on a personal level, that is.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I feel a bit overwhelmed by your very kind, generous praise. Thank you. Well, first of all, my father was a bookseller, so I was completely surrounded all my life by books, and his response to any interest that I showed, and later my sister showed, would be to bring us the books from the shop that that met what question it was that we'd asked. And so very, very, very early, I mean, as long ago as I can remember, the world inside my head was as important as the world outside. I mean, what I could discover through imagining it, through reading, had as much of a presence. This is slightly different from some childhoods. I mean, the omnipresence of books and the omnipresence of the represented world through what is conjured rather than what is experienced directly, that was really highly marked in my childhood because of being surrounded by books. And there are other writers whose childhoods are rather similar. It's not unusual for writers to emerge out of a very strong background of books and imaginative journeying.
First, I wanted to ask you more specifically, what do you think are the conditions of possibility for storytelling today? And I would like to pick up on something that you wrote in your book Once Upon a Time, a short history of fairy tales that came out last year, which is a very readable, very dense book where you tell the whole history of fairy tales in not that many pages actually, but where you trace the fairy tale then according to what you say is 6 main defining characteristics. First of all, that they are short narratives. Second, that they are familiar stories, which then present themselves as some sort of accumulated wisdom. That they evolve through combinations and recombinations of known elements, that they are linguistic acts of imagination, that's also consoling, helping people in hard times, that they interweave the supernatural agency and pleasure and wonder, and that they express hope, and then typically hope through this happy ending. And you find these characteristics to be quite persistent or consistent throughout the history of the fairy tale. But then you end up your book in a somewhat different note, where you claim that today fairy tales are, you don't say that they're no longer possible, but they are gradually turning into myths. That is, that they are stories held in common about the deepest dilemmas, but are no longer aiming at being optimistic or consoling, but rather more bearers of wisdom, deep, thought-provoking, and illuminating. And I was wondering if you could explain what you mean by that, and what do you think are the reasons for this development?
Well, one of the distinctions between myth and fairy tale in the past would have been that myths featured gods and goddesses, and that they felt to us as if they were connected to somebody's religion. It would be not our religion, but that the Greeks believed in those gods and goddesses, the Norsemen believed in those gods and goddesses, and the Aboriginal Australians believed that those were divine beings in the stories that they were telling. We don't remember them as well as we did. I mean, the culture of classical Greek mythology, which I was brought up in, for example, is not really known the way it was. They have slightly fallen away. And with that fading, what has happened is that the difference between fairies and gods has slightly changed. So fairies now feel powerfully supernatural, more powerfully supernatural than they used to. If you were a Victorian child, you would have known more about Zeus and Hera and Aphrodite, because even children's books had the stories of the Odyssey and the Iliad. And fairies were little creatures who looked like insects and had butterfly wings and lived inside flowers. And they were not nearly as powerful. So there's a disparity. But what's happened is that with the fading of the mythologies from our consciousness and the salience of fairies and supernatural agents of one kind or another through massive amounts of popular media. I mean, for example, trolls. I don't know enough about trolls in the past in Scandinavia, but they are now absolutely ever present. I mean, they are a very powerful figure of the contemporary imagination. And the whole concept of a pervasive magic has, I think, it's been one of my arguments, has been intensified by the ordinary magic of our technologies. Because we live in first of all, the ordinary magic of our technologies disseminates these ideas much faster and much more ebulliently than at any period previously. I mean, the speed and multiplication of such motifs across the web. The web is an absolute powerhouse of supernatural imaginings. And it's carried by a technology that is itself weirdly immaterial, uncanny. They call it the digital uncanny, and I think that's a very good phrase. So the digital uncanny has also made possible CGI, computer-generated imagery, that has a very, very strong material convincing presence. So, for example, Avatar, a film I quite liked. I mean, I thought it was actually rather a powerful film. In Avatar, those flying dinosaurs on which the heroines and heroes actually ride. So the real figure rides on a CGI animal. So you see a real actor, not like in Disney where everything is cartoons. In a CGI film, the real people, as you know, are mixed up with CGI-generated creatures. And so for a child, the presence is extremely vivid. I mean, even for adults, the presence is extremely vivid. It's quite difficult to remember that these are not real animals that are flying through these extraordinarily vivid landscapes. So this destabilization of reality through our uncanny and digital media has actually created a mythological presence of forces that are more like fairyland than they are like gods. It's no longer embodied in individuals. It's much more embodied in these forces.
So they become a sort of new myth.
Yeah, and so as a result, I think, they've grown. They've rather overtaken the landscape of the imagination, and with that effect, more and more adults are now reading this material. So one of the one of the effects has been that we have the crossover book. Now, there were crossover books in the past. In fact, you could call the Odyssey a crossover book. But Alice in Wonderland is a crossover book. But now there really are many, many. I mean, J.K. Rowling, as you know, packaged for 2 different sets of readers. The Lord of the Rings, the Philip Pullman, whom I admire very much, these are now read by children and by adults. But of course, adults are not only satisfied by the promise coming out right. Adults know they want more complexity than that simple promise, which I really believe in. I really love the simple promise, but it is a simple promise. And so more and more fairy tale material does not offer hope. I mean, that is just something that has happened. Pan's Labyrinth is a Guillermo del Toro's film. I don't know if it was a hit here in Scandinavia. It's a very, very powerful, very good film, and a very good example of what's happening, because it's a fairy tale, and there are little fairies in it, little digitized fairies that appear at the very beginning. But it's also a mythic story of a descent into the underworld by a little girl. So she's both Alice, she even looks like Alice, but at the end she doesn't come out, she's sacrificed. She's a Persephone figure who goes into the dark, into the winter, and down underground in order to regenerate. So that's, you see, that's an example of the combination of elements that is, and it's responding to, an understanding of what you were talking about, the conflicts and disasters in the world. And the Gothic is a very good barometer of when there is a sense of deep unease, a sense of clashing and ambiguous states that we have no solution to. So you get peaks in the Gothic. The Gothic comes with the French Revolution. It returns at the end of the 19th century with a lot of chaos between secularism and anti-clericalism and the church, and then the rise of communism, rise of fascism. The Gothic, very, very strong. And the Gothic is again very strong.
It's again very strong with all this.
So the Gothic is a twist on fairy tale.
But darker.
But very dark, yes. Yeah, and also grotesque. Grotesque is a form of darkness that is comic. So you have this, the sort of vampire film, which is now, vampires, there will be another index, to take them as a figure rather than as a genre. So Gothic is the genre, but vampires are the figure. So zombies and vampires used to be different. Zombies used to be slaves who had been evacuated of their personality, their soul, and just driven by the slave master, the zombie master, to do his will, usually his will. So they would just walk, shuffle, do their job all night long, all day long. And they really grew out of slavery in the plantations in the West Indies. And they were very different. But then in the mid-19th to 20th century, they began to be turned into vampires. So in the great film, The Night of the Living Dead, the zombies are cannibals. And they come back. And though they behave like zombies, they shuffle and they have no volition. Their one drive is to devour, is to eat. So they have become figures. In Romero, the director's mind, it was quite clear. He was very conscious. He was a politically conscious person. They were figures of the proletariat rebelling against their enslavement by the industrial military complex of America. So
we're really living in these mythic times now.
Well,
more maybe so than ever.
Well, certainly the mass media and the possibilities of the digital uncanny have created, conditions in which ideas spread in a very epidemic way. And so, yes.
And I guess it also, because fairy tales are more for like common people, that you can invent stories that You were talking about, for example, is when you're starving, you can invent stories about this bowl of porridge that never is empty, and that aspect has then disappeared, or the possibility for that has disappeared. Those simple stories that we tell each other with happy endings that are consoling and that are a different fabric of life?
Well, no, I don't think the possibility has vanished, and I think that there's a role for fairy tale. In a sense, I would like to bring that back. And I mean, I think there are some examples, mass market examples, where that still takes place, and feminism has made a difference to that. I mean, because there were, it was the post-war generation has now raised an entire new generation. They are now in place, writing books, writing poetry, composing. So you get some examples of songs. I mean, there are some very interesting singers who use fairy tale motifs, who think about these issues. And it's a way, I mean, what some of the young women do is they look at the pain of human beings, sometimes the female pain, but sometimes pain in relationships. So it's also male pain or the pain of a child. And they think about that in their songs. And then, of course, there's a lot of women working in film, and they have made a difference to the direction of film. I don't particularly want to sort of insist on the mass market element, but it's easier to talk about mass market examples because people more likely in hearing this will have seen them. Mm-hmm. But for example, Angelina Jolie's film of The Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent, which is also a sort of Snow White film. In that, Angelina Jolie, who has very particular political ideas, as you probably know, she's quite a serious global campaigner for very good causes, and she's adopted many children herself. Whatever you think about that, whether this is, but anyway, she thinks about things. And she was the producer of Maleficent as well as the main role. And she's an example of of an actress, or actor as we now call them in English. She's an example of an actor who, reaching a certain age, has become very interested in the older women in fairy tales. Mm. This is a phenomenon across the cinema at the moment. All the female actors who are now in their 40s are playing the wicked stepmother, the wicked fairy. They're interested in exploring figures of female agency and seeing if that agency, which has previously been stigmatized as evil, can actually be understood, not explained away, but understood, entered from within, empathized with, and therefore you enlarge the sense of consciousness. And I think in Maleficent she really got quite near to doing something very, very interesting with the figure of the wicked stepmother. And I was very moved by the change she introduced to the story. So at the end, when the Sleeping Beauty is lying cursed, and the prince has kissed her, and she hasn't woken up.
She hasn't woken up.
She doesn't wake up with the prince's kiss, because it's not true love. So she doesn't wake up. And at that point, the wicked queen, who has cursed her, wicked fairy, is overcome by remorse. And she goes up to the Sleeping Beauty and asks her forgiveness for this terrible thing that she did. And that wakes her up. And I really thought that was very beautiful, because this was the conversion of the evil stepmother realizing that she actually loves the child. And that was I think that was a lesson that, Angelina Jolie had truly thought about her position as a foster mother, as a possibly stepmother. I don't know if she's a stepmother, but as a foster mother, that this tense relationship that is so enshrined in fairy tales, that there's never any redemption in that relationship in fairy tales, that she tried to introduce it.
And then it becomes like a counter narrative, right? And
yes,
that's something that you are working a lot on too, both in relationships to fairy tales and in relationship to myths also,
and to political ideology.
And to political ideology, which mythology, of course, is steeped in.
Absolutely.
And that was because I was going to bring up this, because myths have a dual function or a dual significance. On the one hand, they signify something they act as keys to understanding our inner lives, the structures of our consciousness, and maybe even unconsciousness, and the whole society, the consciousness of the whole society. Yes. So they're bearer of knowledge, wisdom, insights, and stuff like that. But on the other hand, of course, they're very, very strong ideological tools.
Yes.
As, for example, Roland Barthes has shown
Yes.
us, but also Simone de Beauvoir and Angela
Yes.
Carter, how myths are then historical constructions, which actually then masquerades as some sort of natural fact.
Yes.
And I was going to ask you about, because you write a lot about that in another book of you called Managing Monsters, 6 myths of our times, where you link this ideological baggage in myths to power structures on 3 levels. And one of them is exactly how then myths control children and women, and how they are expressions of masculine power, and also how they're on a national level always construct national identity by purging it from something alien, something outside, some foreigner.
Yes.
And of course these power structures need to be deconstructed, as you say, but you still insist that the most powerful antidote remains that of telling counter stories. And this you wrote in 1994, but I guess you still believe that.
Yes,
don't you?
Yes. I mean, I think that some aspects of those, they were lectures originally, 6 Myths of Our Time. Some aspects are really disappointingly unchanged. I mean, I think, for example, I wrote about the expectation of masculinity, because while I'm a feminist, I also have a son, and I'm very, very aware of how men are constructed too. And I do feel that has shifted a little. I mean, there is a better tolerance of men's parenthood, whereas before, men were simply expected to go back to work immediately. It made no difference to them whether they'd had a child or not. Whereas now, even in England, we give them a little bit.
You're supposed to care.
They give them a little bit of time to be at home with their new baby, and the baby's mother. So there are ways that has shifted, and men now in England, for example, don't feel that they can't carry their baby on their tummy, in the street, or wheel their baby. Literally, my father would never have, had a baby thing. It just was not done. Men did not do that. So the construction of masculinity has shifted a bit, but not nearly enough in my respect. I think that young men are expected to be, hard and sexually aggressive in ways that are very damaging to them as well as to the women, as well as to women.
But just to come back to the Arabian Nights, because some of this movement then from bedazzlement to condensation.
Condescension, yes.
Thank you. It's also this othering of the other, right? And belittling of the other, or exotitation of the other, or making him into this something completely other than the subject. But it also does something with the notion of the magic, and the notion of the wonder, and the notion of amusement, and that some kind of magic then can only be tolerated when wearing foreign dress, and they don't really fit into our rational way of thinking. And I think one of the most important things that you are doing in Arabian Nights is that you're trying to resuscitate some of the earlier, more visionary and tolerant engagement with Oriental material. And 2 of your main characters, or your 2 favorite characters in this respect, is Mozart, particularly his Così fan tutti, and then Goethe with his Westöstliche Divan. And I know this is a very broad question, but perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about those 2, and what do you think we can learn from Mozart and Goethe today?
Well, I suppose with Così fan tutte, which actually people think of as rather misogynist and also rather Orientalist, because there's often a very comic scene when the 2 lovers come back dressed as Albanians, in fact, but in full Ottoman dress. The people have often dismissed that as being, and the abduction from the Seraglio also is a kind of harem fantasy of a savage despot, typically Oriental. So people don't associate Mozart with such tolerance or broadening of one's ideas about the East. But the point that I tried to make, and I think Edward Said actually makes it first, so I shouldn't claim it, is that at the end of the opera, when they all sing together, they have all been changed by the experience. So they've all realized that they've entered, that by their encounter with this imagined other, they've learned something about themselves, and they're humbler. They entered more deeply. They're in their discovery that they are easily led, easily taken in, easily overtaken by prejudices or yes, that they have become, in a sense, the music makes us feel they've become better people because it's so sublimely beautiful, where they're all singing together, and there is this, and there's a sadness in it. It's not a happy finale. There's a sadness and a troublement. It's ambiguous, but basically they've encountered something that makes them understand themselves better and understand each other better.
And that's also because it plays not only on otherness, but also on sameness.
Yes, yes.
The attraction to the Arabian Nights.
Yes, yes. So I think there are 2 points. One is that there is a definite underlying prejudice that makes it possible for the Western reader to consume pleasure as long as it's distanced in costume. That still continues. It's still a very, very strong device. We are not irrational, they are irrational, and watching them being irrational is great fun for us. We dress soberly, we wear proper suits, they wear crazy clothes with, silks, and men wear perfume and earrings, for God's sake, So, so we can enjoy seeing them do this, and sometimes we like dressing up like them too, because this is
exactly what they did.
I'm now working. I'm going to write an essay on fancy dress. Fancy dress in the Empire was a tremendous divertissement at Christmas. Mm-hmm. So all these, British colonial servants with huge moustaches and beards would dress up as gypsies. And anyway, I'm quite interested in this othering of yourself in order to get to a place where you feel more yourself. So there is an underlying prejudice. We are the rational ones, they are the irrational ones, and we just absorb and we voyeuristically enjoy watching them perform. So that's not so good. But at the same time, through a work like Così fan tutte, or perhaps presenting the Arabian Nights in a certain way, as I sort of tried to do, and quite a lot of writers now are taking up different themes in the Arabian Nights and trying to do something with them that also speaks to this need to open up dialogue between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world, and there's a lot of imaginative strategies. In fact, very, very interesting ones. So there is a way in which the accepting this history of othering can take us to a place where it's not so much that they cease to be other, because, as you know, in the philosophy of gender and identity and so forth, we need to respect difference. So it's very important not to create an assimilationist program, not to make them same, but to keep distinctiveness, but for the distinctiveness to be rooted in history and the understanding of different approaches to knowledge. I mean, one of the areas where there's been a lot of work. And I noticed that Salman Rushdie has actually just written a short story in the current New Yorker about this. There's been a lot of work on the transmission of Western knowledge through Arabic copyists, and also Arabic commentators. Mm-hmm. So Rushdie, who's actually called after Averroes, the name is made up. His father made it up. The name was something else. his father made it up in homage to Averroes, whose name in Arabic is Ibn Rushd. So Rushdie in this short story is writing about Ibn Rushd, after whom he was named by his father, and how Ibn Rushd copied Aristotle and other Greeks, and then got into trouble for his work and was banished from court in Andalusia. And then, after the fundamentalists in that era were repudiated by the Sultan, Averroes was brought back to court. So, in a sense, Rushdie sees his own story of being banned as in the light of the past. But in this short story, he also tells the story of the transmission of Greek philosophy through Arabic,
through Arabic
transmission.
Because that's actually what the Arabic tradition did. They kept alive these Greek traditions where
and there's been a lot
Europe
of
was busy being Christians actually.
And there's been a lot of historical work now on early waves of the different. I mean, it's very, very complicated, the different dynasties and the different histories of larger Andalusia, which went right up to Toledo, and the smaller Andalusia that fell when Granada fell. And anyway, one of the sort of good effects, if one could say such a thing, or consequences, has been an attempt to deepen. Since 9/11 has been an attempt to deepen our understanding. But we're still extremely short of people who can read Arabic. I mean, I can't read Arabic, and though I'm very interested in it, and Rushdie can't read Arabic. I mean, he writes a lot about it, but he can't read it. I mean, of course he can't read it. Why should he be able to read it? But what I'm saying is that one of the sources of the misunderstanding is simply that we're ignorant. I mean, we are deeply ignorant.
In your book on myths, you end each chapter by telling your own counter story to these power structures, and in a sense, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, your whole writing career consists in trying to make such counter stories. And in this respect, I also think that it's right to read Stranger Magic, your study of Arabian Night, as a counter story or setting up of a counter story. Yeah. Yes, and maybe first and foremost because it's the interweaving of the different legacies of the book. As you state in the introduction, of course, Arabian Nights is both unmistakably Arabic, and at the same time, it's a legacy of world literature. Presenting a polyvocal anthology of world myths, fables, and fairy tales. And it's exactly this dual kind of situation or situatedness of the work that is also characteristic for your own specific take on it. Because you're seeking both then to find these Arabic influences, these European influences, and trying to tie them together in yet a new, intricate, interwoven story about not only the past, but also about the present time. So I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on this point, what I see as your own methodology maybe in this work. And I want to ask you, do you perceive yourself perhaps as just as much a storyteller as an interpreter, an academic? If, of course, I mean, it's possible to distinguish these two practices.
I was in Paris, actually, when the first war in Iraq broke out. And I was listening very carefully to the radio because it was in French. So I had to pay more attention to understand it. And all the words, the names of the places where this war was happening, were all familiar to me. But they were familiar to me from the Arabian Nights. And when it said La Route de Basra, I thought, my God, the road to Basra, that's in, several of the and that made me realize that these two maps were the same map. I mean, the map of the Arabian Nights, which seemed to be totally fantastic, was actually the same ground that was now this battlefield. And of course that continued. And I did feel, what is there for me to do? I mean, I can go on a march, I can tell the government, to the deaf ears of the government that I don't believe in their war. But this is I can't do anything. But maybe as a writer, I can try and look at these stories and see if there's another way of thinking about this. And that's what led me to what you kindly described. Exactly what I tried to do is I tried to give an alternative, a counter-narrative, first to the Orientalism of the Arabian Nights, in the sense that they had, though much loved, they had always been thought of as exactly the kind of Orient that put the Orient into, a weak, exotic perspective that demeaned it, that didn't grant it adulthood, that made it infantile, and so I began, and I wanted. So there were two axes. The principal axis was that the book had, to some extent, been made in common. That doesn't mean that they weren't originally Persian, Indian, Turkish, etc., from the region, Asia Minor and the Middle East, but that they had been so taken up by the West in its enthusiasm. First of all, that the first publication was in French, and then the dissemination. Most people have not read the Arabian Nights, but most people know the Arabian Nights, and that's a paradox. I mean, this is a book that is known through numerous, transformations in other media, or just by word of mouth, or proverbial. Shahrazad means something, Ali Baba means something, Aladdin means something. So these things are in the air. So I was interested in that. But then, really, I suppose the heart of the book is an answer to the question: why did the Enlightenment take up this book? Because it comes out in the early 18th century, and its popularity spreads and increases all through the siècle de lumière, the Enlightenment. And I try to answer that by suggesting that there are elements in the book that refract reality in extremely illuminating ways, and that this was unconsciously recognized by its first receivers.
But it's still a complicated story you tell. I mean, it's interesting in itself that the Arabian Nights circulated in manuscript form in Arabic for centuries, but that, as you said, the first printed edition is the French translation and editing, of course, by Antoine Galland,
yes.
that came out in the beginning of the 18th century. And then you like his Galland's take on it. I mean, he takes out a lot of things, but still he writes with this gaiety and interest and understanding that kind of makes the stories flourish in some certain way. But then you recount the story about its dissemination in the West that is somewhat disheartening, going from this initial awe, inspiration towards more and more commercialization, exoticization, and belittling, maybe even too. You talk about it as a development from bedazzlement to condensation.
Condescension.
Condensation. And
yes.
What do you think the reasons?
I think
for
that's
that?
a quote from Edward Said.
Yes,
that's
a quote.
It's a quote from Edward Said. Yes, in Orientalism. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what do you think the reasons for that are? Why couldn't
definitely
they keep this?
They're definitely political. They're to do with the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the gradual degradation and enfeeblement and the rise of the Western powers, the French Empire and the British Empire in particular, and this because I mean it's an absolute. We still are suffering. Indeed, could not be suffering more the after effects of these periods of colonization and their attitude to cultural legacy, which shows again how important the relationship to culture is, because one of the main differences between myth and fairy tale and myth as a religious form of narrative is that there has never been a demand that fairy tale has never had an institution that has demanded obedience. There is no such thing as the imperative for acquiescence to the belief system of fairyland. And that's a huge difference. And one of the reasons that fairy tale is attractive to contemporary writers and filmmakers and theatre and so forth is because it is an open field. You can do whatever you want with it. There is no priest, there is no pope, there is no mullah.
But the counter stories then, how can they be told? And who can tell them, and how will they be disseminated, and will they be heard, or will they just become part of
I think one can only, I mean, if one's going to have any sort of belief in the humanities at all, and I have not only a belief in the humanities, I have a kind of deep conviction that, you know, to put it very sort of crudely, that imagination actually leads reality. We have very great difficulty in understanding reality. We have difficulty in knowing what is happening to us if we haven't got some prior structures and images to bring to deciphering it. So it seems to me that it is absolutely imperative that we continue to commit ourselves to weaving this fabric. But unfortunately, the arts are considered a sort of luxury. You know, the arts are often the front line of responses to ecology, to the sense of what it is to be human, to responsibility. It's frequently the artists who immediately will make works to try and embrace humanity, or at least institute justice. So if you don't try and keep them flourishing, I mean, they will continue. It's not as if, you know, they need subsidy to people. Humans do that, but it is better if they're given propitious circumstances in which that can happen.
And then you, at the end, you describe the whole of the Arabian Nights in the following terms as these really big, immense amount of stories that's immensely complicated, that is immensely long, but at the end they tie together, or the story comes out. And then you have moved them from what you call the complacent cynicism from the frame story towards then a politics of love and justice that opens the cruel sultan's eyes to another vision of humanity and to his responsibility as a ruler. And what I wanted to ask you about too was, is this very length and complexity indicative of how much work it takes to reach new visions of humanities? And do you think that in our hustle-bustle time, that everything has to go so quickly and fast, that we actually have the patience to reach a new vision?
One of the things that I'm very aware of is that a lot of the finest contemporary work across different media, film and music and writing, are very committed to slowness, very committed to concentration, absorption, the process, the patient, persevering, and that actually one of the reasons I think people like going to museums and like going to contemporary art is they like to be made to slow down. It's the very opposite of a game show. You go to a museum, there's a film about the National Gallery recently made by Fred Wiseman, a very old American documentary filmmaker. And there are scenes in the film in which he just films people looking at paintings. And it's very, very clear that they're lost in this act of looking at the picture. Silent, slow, quiet, and infinitely mysterious. Because we absolutely can't know, and probably they're not formulating thoughts. You don't stand in front of a Goya and think, oh yes, the line is very... You just have this moment in which the space opens out. You know, the hustle bustle, the emails stop coming, your phone is off. You have a clear space in which you sink yourself into someone else's mind. And that is the state of sort of othering, where you actually find that richness of reciprocity, of the exchange, and not necessarily at a verbal level.
I just want to thank you for
Thank
this
you very
wonderful
much. Thank you very, very
conversation.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.